Hi Pre-Calc. Today I want to talk about section 4.7, which is inverse trigonometric functions. And if you remember back, I guess it was in chapter 2 or 3, we talked about relations, functions, and then we talked about one-to-one functions. If you remember, for a relation, there was no rules for how the domain and range were paired. And if something is a function, each x goes to exactly one y. And then after a function comes one-to-one functions. And if you remember, this had two rules. It had the previous rule, which was each x goes to exactly 1y, and each y goes to exactly 1x, right? That's what the definition of a one-to-one function is. And what's significant about that, and why I'm making an effort to make an introductory video for this section, is that one-to-one functions are critical to understand this because they're the only type of functions that have an inverse. They are the only type of functions that have an inverse. Okay, they are the only type that has an inverse. So let me remind you, if each x goes to exactly 1y, that means that it passes the vertical line test. And if each y goes to exactly 1x, that passes a horizontal line test. So for something to have an inverse, it has to pass both the vertical and the horizontal line tests. And if it passes both tests, then you can find the inverse of that. Now, let's just talk a moment about an inverse. An inverse is an opposite, okay? So if I wrap a gift, the inverse would be to unwrap it, okay? If I add 5, the inverse would be to subtract 5. So we've talked about inverses before, and I've made this statement before, but now we're applying it to the trig. And you should pause for a moment, and when you think of the trig, when you think of some of the functions that are trig, you should be thinking, wow, they miserably fail the horizontal line test. And that's true. But if you remember, I told you that you can cut. Remember, I told you in the past, if you have a function that is not one-to-one, you could restrict the domain. Like, for instance, I could restrict the domain on this function to just say x is greater than or equal to 0. And then I just have half of this function, and then it passes both the vertical and the horizontal, so this piece has an inverse. You're going to notice as you go through the trig functions, it's the same concept. We could take something that is just, so the trig function, this trig function in of itself is just a function. It's not one-to-one, but if you cut a segment of it, you can make it one-to-one. So I spent a lot of time in the videos trying to explain to you how we make them one-to-one, and how all over the world we have the same one-to-one cut, which is very significant, okay? So this is the intro video. I hope you like all the other videos. I really tried to break it down to the nitty-gritty so you could understand this section, which is a bit more complicated than other sections, but I think since I broke it down to the nitty-gritty, you should be pretty good understanding it. Okay, gang. Okay, just catch you in another video then. Hope you're enjoying this. Bye-bye.